If quitting your job is supposed to be the bold move, why does the smartest answer sound almost boring? Because once you strip away the online fantasy, the real question is brutal. Who can actually afford to fail? And if the answer changes everything, then maybe most of what we call betting on yourself is just expensive advice. So let's get into the part nobody wants to say out loud. He basically said not everyone should quit and become a founder, which is so annoying and also probably true, because everybody online makes entrepreneurship look like a personality upgrade. Like you quit your job and suddenly the lighting gets better. Exactly. And the first thing he says is no, most people should stay put. That is such an unsexy answer for the internet. But his whole point is risk is not distributed equally. If you have kids, a mortgage, or a huge paycheck, the math changes. The internet never wants math, though. The internet wants a montage and a hoodie, and a podcast clip where somebody says, just bet on yourself. He is basically saying betting on yourself without a cushion can be stupid. And that part about being young being the real advantage hit hard. No wife, no kids, low expenses, low consequences. Translation, fewer people will yell at you if you fail. Bro, that is the real entrepreneur advantage. But I also liked that he did not romanticize it at all. He keeps repeating that a lot of businesses fail and most founders make nothing, which is the exact sentence people skip when they see the Lamborghinis. The Lamborghini is always the trailer, never the full movie. And he was even harsher about social media. He basically called it a lie machine. Not subtle, just straight to the throat. But he is not wrong when you think about how clip culture works. People see the top 1% and assume that is the average. Meanwhile, the average founder is just exhausted and underpaid, and checking the bank account like it owes them rent. I also liked his point that entrepreneurship still needs workers. He is almost defending employees more than founders are. That is wild, because founders usually act like employees are NPCs. He said the quiet part out loud. There is no self-made myth. Teams matter, mentors matter, even random people matter. That story about the first GM helping him scale was huge. He is saying growth is usually a relay race, not a solo sprint. Yet every founder bio is written like they wrestled the company into existence alone, with one hand while answering emails with the other. And then he shifts into this thing about what a real business actually is. That part got interesting because he is almost attacking the word entrepreneur itself. He is like, if you do everything yourself, you are not really a business owner. You are a technician with a brand. A glorified one-person operation with a logo, which to be fair is most people. And that is where delegation becomes the whole game. He is not saying be lazy, he is saying stop trapping yourself inside the work. That is the part people hate hearing because it means letting go. He literally says the business has to be sellable. If nobody can buy it without you, it is not really an asset. That is the cleanest definition drop in the whole conversation. And also the most painful for a lot of people, because it forces you to ask what you actually built. Did you build a company, or did you build yourself a job with paperwork? Ooh, that is brutal. And then he gets into the technician versus owner distinction. That is probably the sharpest thing in the whole episode, because a lot of people are proud of doing everything, and that pride is the trap. They confuse control with competence, and exhaustion with importance. That one is disgusting, but yes. His example of selling lashes through a team instead of being the lash person makes sense. Because then the owner is actually building systems, not standing behind the chair. And that is how you create valuation. Not by being busy, by being replaceable. Which is offensive if your whole identity is, I work so hard. I also thought his family comparison was interesting. His parents had stable, credentialed lives, and he still looked at that and said no. That is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. That is personality. He basically admitted he just does not like authority, which is the most founder sentence ever. But I do think that part matters because not every career choice is ideological. Some people are just wired to hate being told what to do. And unfortunately, society keeps putting those people into meetings. That is why so many founders are running on irritation. The funny thing is, he does not even hate employees. He actually respects them because he knows the whole machine collapses without them. That is a much healthier view than the fake hustle stuff. The fake hustle stuff is always lonely anyway. And then there is the money conversation. He is basically saying if you already make a lot, walking away is not automatically brave. It can just be reckless with nicer branding. Reckless with nicer branding is crazy. But he is right that risk should match your runway. A 22-year-old and a 42-year-old with 5 dependents are not living the same life. Same advice cannot apply to both. The gurus hate that sentence because it ruins the universal formula. There is no universal formula, just better and worse timing. That is why his advice feels practical instead of motivational. And honestly, practical is rarer than inspirational these days. Inspirational is cheap. Practical makes people uncomfortable because it asks for patience. The episode really comes down to one thing. Entrepreneurship is a structure, not a fantasy. It is risk, team building, delegation, and timing. And if you do not respect those parts, the dream eats you. That is such a good line, but also terrible news. I like that he still leaves room for young people to take the shot. He is not anti-risk, he is anti-fantasy, which is probably why the advice lands. Because he built something real, so he can afford to be unsentimental. Unsexy truth always hits harder when the money is real. And when the story is actually backed by 5 years of grinding. All right, let us pause there because the next layer is even better. In the next one, we get into the ego, the scaling, and what he does differently now. That is where it gets really fun. We will get into the part where growth starts demanding a different version of you. The wild part is he is not even selling hustle porn. He is basically saying, calm down, your startup fantasy is not a personality. And that is kind of refreshing, right? Because every other clip online says quit tomorrow and become a legend. Which is hilarious when half those people cannot make rent. His point is more like know your season before you gamble it. That is the line I kept coming back to. If you are young, single, and broke, the downside is smaller. If you have 5 kids and a mortgage, the downside is staring at you. That is not entrepreneurship. That is a family meeting waiting to happen. And he is not even being cruel about it. He is just saying responsibility changes the math, which is the part people hate hearing. They want the motivational quote, not the spreadsheet. Exactly, they want the real, not the risk. And he keeps coming back to this idea that workers are necessary too. That alone will annoy a lot of internet founders. Because apparently having a staff is now uncool if you tweet hard enough. Dude, yes, everybody wants to be the visionary and nobody wants payroll. But he is right that you cannot build anything alone. The whole self-made thing gets exposed pretty fast. A real business has team, systems, mentors, luck, timing, all of it. Not just one guy posting from a rented car. That was unkind but accurate. And his distinction between owner and operator is huge. Because that is where people get confused. If you are doing every lash, every haircut, every delivery, you own a job. You are not the CEO, you are the busiest employee. The title card is lying to you in that case. His whole thing is, can somebody buy this business without buying your calendar? That is such a brutal but clean test. If the answer is no, you built yourself a trap, not an asset. Which is why so many small businesses stay stuck forever. But I also think his honesty about failure is important. Like 80% failing in 5 years is not a cute statistic. That is a massacre if you are romanticizing it. Social media turns it into a sunset and a laptop. And one day later, you are arguing with Stripe support. He is basically trying to puncture the fantasy before it wrecks people. Which honestly is a kindness. Because if you quit a good salary with no plan, that is not bravery. That is panic in nicer clothing. Nice clothing is a very expensive version of panic. And he is also making the point that income changes the equation. If you make 200 grand, you have more to lose than some 21-year-old. That part is actually uncomfortable but true. People act like opportunity cost does not exist until it punches them. Yeah, until the lifestyle gets attached to the paycheck. Then suddenly risk feels very different. I liked that he framed youth as an advantage. Not because young people are smarter, but because they are lighter. No spouse, no kids, no giant fixed obligations. Just bad decisions and energy, which is a powerful combo. But his real point is timing, not ego. You do not need to be heroic if the season is wrong. And the other big idea is delegation. That is where the whole episode becomes interesting. He is saying the minute you stop being the technician, the business changes. That is the difference between making money and making yourself indispensable. Which sounds noble until you cannot leave for a weekend. He gave that Lash Studio example, and it was so clean. If you are the only person doing the service, what exactly are you selling? You are selling your hands, your hours, and your exhaustion. A truly terrible recurring subscription. Unsubscribe immediately. The deeper thing is he respects staff more than most founders do, because he knows they are not placeholders. They are the reason the machine can scale at all. That is such a mature way to look at business. And it is rare because most people only worship the founder. The founder gets the mic, the team gets the workload. Classic arrangement, terrible branding. I also thought his mentor story mattered a lot, because he was almost ready to sell and walk away. Then one good conversation changed the whole trajectory. That is why ego is expensive. If you are too proud to listen, you can kill your own upside. And the funny part is he said it out loud. He did not pretend he knew everything at 21. Rare behavior for a guy with a business card and a dream. Very rare, yes. The business only got real when he changed pricing and focused. That is another underrated lesson. Sometimes the breakthrough is not more effort, it is clearer structure. Or fewer random side quests. The side quests always look productive until they are not. He literally said he had 5 businesses and no focus. That is such a common early-stage mistake. People confuse motion with momentum. And then they wonder why nothing compounds. The 200% better year came from narrowing the game. That is the part people do not want to hear. They want expansion before discipline. He also keeps bringing up visualization, but in a grounded way. Not mystical, more like repeated mental rehearsal. Goals, notes, accountability, quarterly rocks, all of that. Which is way less sexy than manifestation content. Way less sexy, way more useful. And honestly, that is the pattern in the whole conversation. Unsexy truth repeated until it works. Okay, let us leave it there for a second. Because the ego part is where this gets even messier. And I want to get into what happens when success starts feeding the wrong instincts. That is coming up next, and it gets very real. In episode 2, we get into the ego, the scaling, and the pressure to evolve. That advice is almost too honest for internet people. Because the internet wants a hero story, not a spreadsheet. And he is basically saying, hold on, your life context matters. Which is such an unpopular thing to say now. Everyone online acts like quitting is a personality trait. Bro, they romanticize instability like it is a premium feature. But his point is not anti-ambition at all. It is anti-delusion, which is different. That 5 kids DM story was brutal, though, because he was not being dramatic, just honest. If people depend on you, the math changes completely. That is the part people keep skipping. They hear freedom and forget rent exists. Freedom is cute until the electricity bill arrives. He keeps coming back to timing, and that matters. Starting at 21 versus 32 with 5 kids is not the same game. Not even remotely close. One is risk, the other is stress with a LinkedIn bio. That is so rude, but also yes. The crazy part is he is not saying stability is bad. He is saying stable income can be a weapon if you use it right. Exactly, if you have leverage, do not torch it blindly. People quit their salary like they are throwing a chair out the window, and then act shocked when startup life is not a movie. The team point hit hard, too, because he really rejects the self-made fantasy. That part is refreshing, honestly. Entrepreneurs love saying self-made while standing on 10 unpaid miracles. And a few very tired employees. He is basically saying the business is built by people, not ego. That story about the GM scaling with him was the real lesson. One good operator can change the entire trajectory of a company. Which is annoying because founders want to be the whole machine. Yeah, they want founder energy and employee output. That is not how any of this works. The E-myth thing is really the center of it. Technician versus business owner is such a clean distinction. Also a painful one for half the internet. Because half the people saying entrepreneur are just self-employed and exhausted. And he is not insulting that path, just naming it correctly. That matters because language hides the truth. If you are still the worker, you do not own a sellable asset yet. That sentence should be on a wall somewhere. It would make a lot of people uncomfortable, which is usually a good sign. And the valuation logic he gave is actually simple when he says it out loud. If the owner disappears and the business collapses, it is not really a business yet. It is just a job with branding. A very expensive job, usually. That is why delegation is not optional. It is structural. You can hear how much he respects operators, because he has lived the difference between chaos and systems. And the chaos phase sounded very real. Candy bars, lawn mowing, little side hustles, that is pure hustle DNA. That story is funny because it is illegal in spirit but brilliant in execution. The principal heard margin expansion and panicked. Bro confiscated money and suspended for entrepreneurship. But it also shows he was not waiting for permission. Some people are just wired to spot opportunity early. The bigger point is that wiring does not mean everyone should copy it. That is the humility in his take that people miss. He is not saying be fearful, he is saying be realistic. And realistic is not sexy enough for social media. Realistic does not get views like quitting in tears, or like posting a laptop in a coffee shop with a quote over it. His whole argument on the middle-class cycle was interesting too. He is basically saying the old playbook worked in a different economy. Wages, housing, unions, education, all of that used to line up better. Now the same life path costs way more and pays way less. The house price did not get the memo to stay humble. Housing just said, "Congratulations on your degree, now suffer." So the old promise is not gone, but it is weaker. That is why he frames risk by income level. If you are making 200 grand, the downside is very different. People act like all quitting stories are morally equal. They are not, because one mistake is annoying and the other is catastrophic. Catastrophic is such a mean but useful word. The thing I liked most is he is comfortable saying not everyone should chase the same dream. That feels almost rebellious now. Because the algorithm rewards absolutism, not nuance. Nuance gets buried under 10-second motivation clips. And then everybody thinks they need to become the exception. Most people do not need to be the exception to live well. That is probably the healthiest part of the whole conversation. You can want more without burning down your current life. That is the real strategy, not blind leapfrogging. Blind leapfrogging is a great phrase for bad planning. Put that on a shirt and sell it to founders. And the delegation angle actually makes entrepreneurship sound more mature, not cooler. Which is weirdly the opposite of what people expect. Mature business is boring in the best possible way. Boring pays better than inspirational. That is the slogan of the episode right there. All right, let us leave it there for a second. Because next time, the ego problem gets way more dangerous. And that is where the scaling story starts getting messy. We will get into what happens when success starts feeding the wrong instincts. That gets very real very fast. The wild part is he is not selling fantasy at all. That is rare because everybody else is selling escape. Right, like quit your job and become a billionaire by Tuesday. He is basically saying, don't be stupid with your life, which is somehow controversial now. The thing I liked is he separates risk by life stage. If you are young and broke, the downside is way smaller. If you have 5 kids, the downside is not poetic anymore. Yeah, now the downside is groceries. Exactly, and that changes everything. People hate hearing that because they want universal advice. But life is not one-size-fits-all motivation content. Motivation content is literally the problem here. He keeps coming back to social media making entrepreneurship look glamorous. Which is funny because the glamorous part is maybe 1%. The other 99% is invoices and anxiety. And probably answering messages at midnight. He is brutally honest about failure rates too. 80% of businesses fail within 5 years is insane. It should make people pause before they romanticize quitting. Instead, people hear that and think, that will not be me. Every failed business plan has that opening line. And his whole point is not that nobody should try. It is that your situation has to make sense. That distinction matters a lot. He is almost anti-hustle culture in a weird way. But not anti-building, which is the nuance people miss. He is more like build with your eyes open. Revolutionary concept, apparently. Wildly inconvenient for Instagram. The team part was probably the strongest thing he said. Because everybody talks about being self-made like it is a badge. And he just comes in and says that is nonsense. Which is refreshing because it is true nonsense. Nobody scales alone, not really. The story about that manager staying from one location to 4 was huge. That is the invisible part people do not post about. No one is making a reel about a great operations manager. Unfortunately, because that would actually be useful. He kept saying business is about building something sellable. That is where the technician versus owner thing gets real. If you are doing every service yourself, you do not own a business. You own a job with a nicer logo. That line is nasty but accurate. He is saying the value is in systems, not sweat. And that is why delegation is not optional. It is the thing that turns effort into an asset. The weird part is people resist that because they feel replaced. But the business actually becomes more valuable when you are less central. That is hard for ego addicts to hear. And business is full of ego addicts. His focus on reading and finding mentors was solid too. He is basically saying, do not invent the wheel alone. Find somebody who already made the mistakes. Free shortcut if you are humble enough to take it. Humility is expensive for some people. And he gave a smart warning about asking competitors for help. That part was so unfiltered. Like, of course he is not helping you open next door. Imagine walking into your future rival's shop for advice. That is bold or stupid or both. The other thing I liked is he does not fake certainty. He says some things were random and impulsive, which is honest. A lot of businesses start with a weird accident, not a 10-page vision board. Thank God, because most vision boards are just cope. But then he takes the accident and turns it into structure. That is the difference between luck and skill. The luck gets you in the door, the system keeps you alive. And most people only post the door part. Exactly, nobody wants to show the dead-end hallways. His point about younger people taking bigger swings makes sense. When you have less responsibility, you can survive a bad decision. Not comfortably, but you can recover. Recovery is harder when the rent is hungry. The rent is always hungry, honestly. So the message is not quit or do not quit. It is think like an adult before you make the leap. That is a way less sexy sentence, but probably the right one. Yeah, and somehow the right answer is always less sexy. But that is why it works. Next episode, the ego starts wrecking the machine. That is where the story gets even more interesting. Yeah, because success never stays polite for long. All right, let's leave it there for today. We will pick this up and get into the messy part next time.